On today's Meet Kevin Report, we're talking about rent control. And yes, I'm coming to you from Austin, Texas, because our next in-person real estate investing crash course is here in Austin, Texas on Saturday, September 14th. Next stops, by the way, are going to be Miami, San Francisco, Charlotte, and Vegas. Can't wait to see you there. But for now, let's talk about what California just passed in terms of rent control and what you could learn no matter where you are, a landlord, an aspiring landlord, and real estate investor, or you're a tenant and want to know if this is good or bad for you. Hint, I think it's bad for tenants. So what just happened? Well, California passed Assembly Bill 1482, which mandates statewide rent control. You'll be able to extract some lessons from this no matter what state you're in, or country for that matter. So what exactly is statewide rent control? Well, basically, unless you already have rent control, you now have a rent control. And the basics of the law are this. You can no longer raise the rent on a tenant more than 5% per year plus the cost of inflation. So if inflation is 2%, that means you can no longer raise rent more than 7% off whatever you had agreed upon previously. Now there's a cap at 10%. The second part of the law is you can no longer terminate a tenant without cause. See, it used to be that if you didn't want rental property anymore, you didn't want a tenant anymore, or you wanted to sell real estate, all you had to do was wait until the lease expired, and you generally gave your tenant a 30 or 60-day notice to move, and they're out of there. Then you could go sell your vacant real estate. That is, of course, if you wanted to sell the property vacant. For most single-family houses and condos, it makes sense to sell those vacant. They tend to get higher values. Multifamily, you usually want to keep your tenants in place anyway, but there are some important considerations for multifamily as well. So in terms of termination though, here's how the new law works. If you want to get a tenant out, you either get a tenant out through cause or without cause. Cause means the tenant failed some kind of obligation. They didn't pay rent, or they didn't follow the rules of the contract. Now, even if the tenant breaks a rule, it doesn't automatically mean 6 months later you get to kick him out and you don't have to follow the new rules. If a tenant breaks a rule of the contract, I believe, and check with your attorney and your real estate advisors, but I believe you have to give them a 3-day notice to basically cure or quit immediately. Otherwise, you kind of lose that default right. So for tenants, this is going to mean it's very important to keep an eye on every term of your contract and make sure you're following all of the specific terms so you don't lose your new protections, which we're going to talk about if those are good or bad in just a moment. So far we have two parts to this new rule. We have a cap on how much rent can go up every single year, and you can only end a lease if you have cause. That is, the tenant defaulted and you took action to follow up on that cause. This is going to be a big shift because a common thing landlords like to do, especially in multifamily real estate, is they'll buy a multifamily deal, a wedge deal, kind of like what we talk about in the real estate investing course, where I teach you how to buy wedge deals in single family and how to buy wedge deals in multifamily. Completely different strategies, by the way. Which, by the way, two things. A, it's really hot here. It's like 8:40 a.m. and I'm already sweating all over. And B, yes, we are going to do a new course coupon code. This is going to apply to everything on the link below. It's going to be coupon code rent control LOL. The price is going to be a little bit higher than what the price previously was, obviously to reward all of the people who already bought in, but the difference isn't that big. So I still want to see you there. Use coupon code rent control LOL for 22% off. So now let's talk about the practicality a little bit. You buy a place that has a rent-controlled unit, you want to renovate it, you want to raise the rents. What do? How do you get a tenant out? Well, if a lease ends, that is, it gets to the end of its 12-month period, and then it turns over automatically into a month-to-month rental agreement, which is normal. That's how it works, at least in California. You do have the option to terminate the tenant's lease without cause. Without cause means the tenant didn't do anything wrong. Instead, you want to move into it to make it your primary residence. You want to remodel it. You want to take it off the rental market. For whatever reason, you want the tenant out. Well, in that case, you now have to compensate the tenant the equivalent of 1 month's rent, or let them stay their last month for free. So far, this is actually not that bad. Remember, we have this 5% cap plus inflation that rent can go up. And then worst case, if you want to get a tenant out without cause, you're paying 1 month's rent as a landlord to the tenant to sort of assist them in their relocation. But what are the actual implications here? That is this actually good for tenants or is this bad for tenants? And how should landlords protect themselves? Well, let's answer that right now. First things first, let's talk about what this solves. Well, this solves what was commonly done, especially in expensive areas like the Bay Area. You see this happen in New York. Basically, what people would do is they would get tenants in at sort of these teaser rents, and then they would basically prey on the tenants, assuming, they're not gonna wanna move, and hit them with very large rent increases. For example, you might have a $3,000 rent for, an apartment in San Francisco, and you rent it for $3,000, you live there for a year, you're a great tenant, you pay it on time and everything. All of a sudden you get hit with like a $600 rent increase. That's like 20%, which is insane. Yet landlords were able to get away with that because it was pretty much common practice, and then the tenants would basically be sandwiched into this position of, I don't want to move. That would actually make cap rates look pretty dang freaking awesome for some investment properties, because all of a sudden landlords were getting these significantly higher rents, sometimes higher than market value. That now is going to go away, and that sounds great. So far, we've heard a lot of good things for tenants, and basically, hey, more cost of doing business for landlords. Landlords can't raise the rent as much anymore. There's no more of this bait and switch stuff, which is actually honestly a good thing. And if you want to get a tenant out without cause, you're paying 1 month's rent. But what does this mean as a landlord? How do you protect yourself as a landlord now? And does this actually hurt tenants? Well, the way I'm going to tell you to protect yourself as a landlord is pretty much what all landlords should be doing with this new rent control rule, and it ain't gonna be good for tenants. In the real estate investing course, I've always taught that you should raise the rent every single year. Well, unfortunately, there are a lot of landlords. Ew, that's gross. There's a dead rat right there. Anyway, my rule is you raise the rent every single time the lease comes up for renewal. Well, now with the new state-mandated rent control, guess what landlords absolutely have to do? They have to raise the rent, no exception, every single year, for one reason only. If they want to preserve the market value of their property, they need to keep up with the rent. Here's an example. Let's say somebody rents a place out for $2,000, and then they don't raise the rent for 10 years, and now the market value rent of that place is, I don't know, $3,500. Now they want to go to sell the property. Guess what? The new buyer can only raise the rent 5% plus inflation on the 11th year, which means now maybe they're only going up, let's say $125. Now they've got a place that's renting for $2,150 instead of the $3,500 it should be renting for. Now you should immediately be thinking about, well, what's the solution? Well, the solution is you get them out without cause. You pay that tenant 1 month's rent, you get them out, you rent it for market value, right? But here's the problem. Let's say you're a multifamily property owner. Now you have 10 of these units. That's 10 months of rent that somebody, either the buyer or the seller, has to pay to all the tenants to get them out and get these rents back to market value. And you can't just adjust the tenant's rent either. They have to move. So now you have a vacancy and you have to get a new tenant. At least that's my understanding of the law. And keep in mind, I'm just some dude on YouTube, so make sure to fact check all this stuff. But linked in the description below, you'll actually find the PDF of the most recent version of the law, so you're welcome to read it there. So what's the first and biggest implication? Well, the first thing is landlords every single year should be raising the rent. I think gone are the days of landlords no longer raising the rent, because they're going to want to preserve their market value and not run into these 1 month rent donations at the end because they're trying to sell a property for market value. So just to make that very clear, I think gone are the days of no rent increase this year. Now, people subject to rent control are going to want to raise the rent a good amount every single year. In fact, there might even be a second problem, the temptation to raise the rent more because of rent control. See, here's an example. If I have a really good tenant and I'm renting a place out for, let's say, $2,500, I might raise the rent 1%, like $25. I always raise it a little bit, but I just want it to be small enough to where I know they're not going to want to move, and hey, I get a little bit more money and the market value goes up, and really we're just adjusting for the cost of inflation anyway, so the impact is super small. Well, now I look at this and say, well, if I'm going to be limited to 5% on some of these units, maybe I want to start raising the rent 3, 4, or 5% to make sure I'm not falling behind on potential market value. That's going to be a second problem for tenants. So first one is always getting the rent increase. Second problem, possibly getting higher rent increases to make sure landlords aren't falling behind. You want to stay ahead of that curve. And remember, that's all because you want to preserve the resaleability of that property, that market value. Now, what's the next implication? Well, landlords, I highly suggest much more stringent rental contracts. That is, if previously you were thinking, hey, you know what, I'll include the landscaping so I make sure it gets done correctly. Well, this might be your temptation to say, guess what, tenants? You folks in the new lease contract are responsible for the landscaping. So that way, if they screw it up, you have reasons to give the tenants a 3-day notice to cure or quit. It gives you an out potentially. Now be careful with this, but I personally believe the third problem for tenants is tenants are going to see a lot more tenant required maintenance built into their contracts, because that gives owners more options if they decide, you know what, you're just not keeping up on your obligations. You're out with cause because you fail to maintain this, that, or whatever. Now, a fourth potential problem for tenants, and I mean, this might be more theoretical, but honestly, I think tenants especially tenants who lock in potentially lower rents under the protection of rent control, I think they're going to be disincentivized from buying real estate. And I think that's actually going to keep them in this trap for a longer time. That is, everyone who's renting watching this video should be thinking to themselves, what is my game plan for replacing my landlord so I can finally build wealth? That's one of the strategies we teach in the investing course, is how to go from 0 to $1 million. And then obviously I show you how to go from $1 million to beyond that. Now, this has been pretty commonly researched and studied. There is a ton of research on this, but the fifth problem is that any type of rent control tends to actually increase rental prices. And it kind of makes sense, because if people can lock in higher initial rental prices, the landlords are less concerned with the impacts of rent control. So there's actually an incentive for landlords to renovate properties more to lock in higher market rents. And then that way tenants are stuck with higher market rents. So the exception to rent control that just passed in California is single-family houses and condos that are not owned by institutional investors. So if like BlackRock owns thousands of houses, they're subject to rent control. But if irregular owners own single-family houses or condos that do not have any other rentable property on the same lot, they are exempt from this rent control rule. So in other words, pretty much any regular family that owns real estate, and obviously check with your attorney and your real estate advisors, but pretty much any regular family that's looking for those wedge deals, those single family houses, those condos, anybody looking for an opportunity in that space, they're not even subject to this new rent control rule. All this does is increase the complexity of either duplexes, triplexes, fourplexes, multifamily on a larger scale, institutionally owned properties. It's going to increase the cost of business for any kind of real estate fund or real estate investment trust. And ultimately, it might create some opportunities for buyers of wedge deals. Why? Because if people already have lower locked-in rents on smaller multifamily properties, the sellers might not be willing to deal with kicking the tenant out, paying that last month rent, replacing the tenant, and then finding a new one to sell the property for a market value. So there might be some more opportunities to buy wedge multifamily real estate because of rent control. So it's taking away some wealth from sellers and giving it to buyers. But again, as far as that single family space, wedge deals will continue. These extra complexities won't even apply, which is shocking, but hey, whatever. But really, to me, this new rent control law in California is just another classic example of lawmakers not understanding the practicality of owning real estate. That is, I think savvy landlords are going to stay up on rent increases, they're going to start rent prices out higher, and they're going to increase maintenance terms to make sure they leave options for them to potentially kick out tenants. Now, obviously, verify this, read the link in the description below so you could read the rent control law yourself. Follow me on Instagram, and if you have any questions about the course, always feel free to email me at kevin@meetkevin.com. Thanks so much. Have a great day.